all of our blacksmiths are going to be letting people take the hammer. So we'll be showing you how we transform guns into garden tools. So you can still register. It's going to fill up probably. So go ahead and hop over to Philly and hang out with us for a couple days. And we're going to do it every year, I think. So um, then, oh, listen to this. So book club next month. We're still locking everything in, all the details, but it's going to be a compilation book around the crisis in Gaza and the West Bank, and so we'll be announcing that. But then we decided for December we want to do a fun, wild apocalyptic book club. So George Orwell's 1984, y'all. Boom, get it? Get ready. December book club. I'm inviting my 11th grade English teacher, Drew, who's a supporter of ours, and the first person that helped me walk through George Orwell. I don't
Mm.
know if you've seen those shirts that say make George Orwell fiction again," but it's so my wife is going to be our book club guest since it's a little hard to get George Orwell. We'll have Katie Brotherton, and that's the best you couldn't ask for more. So, but tonight is all about making it plain. And Drew, if you don't know, has been a really incredible thinker and theologian and practitioner, activist. We're going to hear about the origin of Anabaptism, but that's often on the social media, doing some great teaching at Messiah. And the subtitle of the book, Making It Plain, is Why We Need Anabaptism and the Black Church. So, yeah, man, good to be together.
Yeah, good to see you again. Yeah, I'm looking forward to this conversation.
Yeah, me too. And by the way, whatever you're watching on, whether it's, Facebook or right here on Zoom or on the other social media on YouTube, you can put your questions or thoughts in the comments. And Brandon, who's rocking it over here, is kind of watching, monitoring all that, so we get it in our messages over here. So put your thoughts in there. Tell us where you're joining from. We see like some folks in Chicago, North Carolina, Oregon. We got Kona, Hawaii in here tonight, and lots of others. We've had folks joining from a lot of other countries too. So if you haven't read the book, just lean in tonight. It's going to be great. If you have read it, then throw some thoughts in the chat there. So first, dude, I mean, this isn't a memoir, but you tell a little bit of your story. Obviously, who you
Yeah.
are is integral to how we interpret the Bible and the world and things, the principalities and powers. Um, and one of the things, it was, kind of hard to miss the gentle jab at Messiah. You said it was one of the most prolonged, explicitly racist experiences of your life. So
Yeah.
the Lord works in mysterious ways. Now you're teaching there, and I've
Yep.
heard you
Yep.
talk about how much you love your students. But I think a little of that backdrop's helpful because it's also kind of what opened the door to some of the gifts of Anabaptism and later your critique of it too. But yeah, man, tell us a little bit how you got there.
Yeah. I mean, so again, I'm what, third generation, like my dad was a pastor. I come from a line of preachers and pastors and church planters. So I'm definitely a son of the Black church. And then given a sense of calling to ministry and decided to do biblical studies, right, going into college, and found myself in Central PA, not knowing much about Messiah or Central Pennsylvania for that matter, right? And and two things happened simultaneously there, right? As you were alluding to, uh, I realized that my many of my white peers who were self-professing Christians were very racist. And at the same time, I was having this amazing experience in the classroom with professors that are introducing me to nuanced, close readings of scripture and what's going on there and themes of justice and peace and the way of Jesus, all that is coming out. And so I'm holding both of those tensions alive at the same time. And I often say, like, I don't think I can make sense of any of my sense of vocation now without the seed of those experiences simultaneously at the same time. That really birthed um, a concern for justice, a concern to live faithfully in the way of Jesus Christ, and introduced me to Anabaptism for the first time, right? Because it was there in that space that I hear them first say Anabaptist, and I'm like, anti-Baptist?
That's
Like, wait a minute,
exactly
be
what I
easy,
thought the
you
first time
know?
I heard it too. Like, why do you hate the Baptists so
Like, what
much?
did we
Yeah,
do? What did we
yeah.
do? Right. So yeah, that was a significant turning point in my journey, that led me to then become an associate pastor at an Anabaptist multiracial church in the city, um, to going back to Philly, at my home church in a Black church space again, moving in those circles, and realizing I had changed, that the Anabaptist stuff had kind of stuck a little more than I had realized. Connecting with, it's a shared friend, Ness. I don't actually name him in the book, but Ness is the one that
Yeah.
introduces me to the Kingdom Builders, the Urban Anabaptist Network, and beginning to realize this plethora of Anabaptists all around the city, that exists there, that were like right under my nose and didn't even kind of recognize prior to that, and expanded my sense of what it means to be an Anabaptist, right? Not just Central PA folks, with the kind of more traditional ways of thinking about Anabaptism. And and then bouncing, I mean, I literally had my foot back and forth in Anabaptist and Black church spaces, over the last 20 years. And so when I moved back to Harrisburg to teach, moved back into a Black neighborhood, have been connected to both Anabaptist and Black church spaces here in Philly, as in Harrisburg as well, and get to teach. Even my teaching, I teach African American theology in the fall. I'll be teaching Anabaptist theology in the spring, right? So these streams are significant for me. They have deeply shaped me as a person, relationships in both streams, and then academically as well. So I don't know if that's helpful, but that's some of the kind of origins that bring me to kind of writing a book like this. Just the influences that they had on me kind of gave me a different perspective on what it means to follow Jesus, as well as some of my critique of mainstream Christianity, which certainly comes out quite a bit in the book as well.
Yeah, and so then you blended those into the anti-blacktivists, and we'll unpack this a little bit more, y'all. If you're still thinking that we're saying anti-Baptist, it's okay. We're going to talk about it, but the anti-blacktivist was, I guess you said it was like Kevin Sweeney or someone that you were talking with. That
Yeah.
you kind of came up with this fusion, but
Yeah.
we'll dig a little deeper. But say a little bit more about where you begin to see that overlap between some of the best of Anabaptism and the best of the kind of historic Black church.
Yeah, so for me, as I'm working this out in my own life, thinking about, these two traditions and trying to take them very seriously, thinking about how they inform my understanding of what it means to follow Jesus, and at the same time, wrestle with some of the tensions and edges that there are some differences about the traditions too. Um, it was helpful for me, I think, especially that multiracial Anabaptist congregation I was a part of in Harrisburg for the first time. I was thinking a lot about like Dr. King, right?
Hmm.
And thinking about how he was embodying and practicing his faith, and particularly how his nonviolence led to working for justice and for confronting systems of oppression within society. And then wrestling with like, well, here my Anabaptist congregation also claims, um, in fact, they would say pacifism. And yet, in that particular congregation, right, at this time, that's my first real meaningful engagement with Anabaptists. I don't see the implications being lived out in that kind of radical way, right? And so there's this
Yeah.
gap in tension that I begin to see. And it's not until my Anabaptist kind of world begins to expand that I realize, all right, there are Anabaptists who are embodying and practicing this thing. And so that's one stream of it, is just me putting folks that I had been studying and learning about. I had gone on civil rights pilgrimages and all that in my 20s, and thinking about what does this actually look like on the grounds? Like when it's actually, embodied and practiced, what does Anabaptism actually mean? And I think at those early stages, I was reinterpreting Anabaptism, not based on what I saw them practicing, but on what they were teaching in light of what I saw King and others practicing, right, in the past. And then as I began to expand my relationships in the Anabaptist community, both, and this is what you're kind of alluding to, like drawing on what I call the radical discipleship stream of Anabaptism and the prophetic witness of the Black church, I feel like in those streams together, I saw the best of each tradition, right?
Mm.
The fullest expression of how to live faithfully in response to the social crises that we face in our contemporary society, being embodied. And I saw that they were actually overlapping. And at
Yeah.
times, like in conversation, working hand in hand a lot more than I had recognized as well. And so I think that for me was a eye opener, right? When I think about, I'm sure friends, I'm sure with like Ched Myers, like who's become
Yeah.
someone I deeply like his witness as I would call him someone I give an example of someone within the radical discipleship stream of Anabaptism who embodies something that I think is really meaningful, that I can look to his life and be like, all right, I see how his commitments to Jesus actually are actual good news, right? In the actual world that we live in today.
Yeah.
Um, or the other person I mentioned quite a bit actually in the book is Vincent Harding, whose
Yeah.
life
Hold up a
actually,
minute. Hold up a minute. Because
yeah, yeah,
Chet and Elaine are really good friends.
yes, they're
I've
wonderful.
been in their home. They've been here.
Yes,
We've done a lot, even within our Red Letter Christians. We've done some stuff with
yeah.
both of them. But I think the first time I met Vincent Harding, Dr. Harding, was with them,
Oh,
and there
really?
was a whole underground seminary
Yeah,
movement. There's
yeah,
still a
yeah,
lot of it happening here in Philly.
yeah.
But Dr. Harding came here to our home and community, and
Uh-huh.
um, really great memories, and of course
Yeah,
he passed what is it, just a year or so ago, right? But
yeah, a
yeah,
couple
and
years now,
and
but
and
yeah,
so yeah, I'm getting old. But yeah, like those are like precious times. So I
yeah.
mean, you use him as one example of the a really holy cocktail of
Of
these
these two
traditions, right?
traditions,
Yeah,
right? I mean, he really is
yeah,
a great example of someone who had raised in Black church spaces, spends a decade in the Mennonite church while he's involved in the civil rights struggle and is wrestling with these two streams and inviting working to expand and push forward the civil rights struggle, as well as calling Anabaptists to their best selves, right? And
yeah,
so, I mean, it's that beautiful crossover that I think really captures, I would say, the heart of what I would call Anabaptism, right? Which is Anabaptism, Black theology in the Black church, and activism, embodied and lived out faith in the world.
yeah. I don't know if
And
you ever got to throw out the Anabaptism to Dr. Harding, but I would think he would very much
we talked
love it.
quite a bit.
Yeah.
So I had mutual friends who introduced us, and so I mean, this is probably not a surprise to you, but Vincent Harding, of course, it was our second conversation, but he pretty much is like, tell your life story, right? And
Yeah,
we
yeah,
just like
yeah.
sit and like long form, like I tell my story, he tells his life story, and he's just a patient, generous listener, and it was really meaningful. But we definitely both talked about our experiences in both Black church and Anabaptist spaces. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, and for folks that don't know, Dr. Harding was, and you mentioned this in the book, he was a friend of Dr. King's, a close organizer with Dr. King. He helped draft some of the most powerful
Yeah.
oratory and speeches of Dr. King, including the Riverside speech, where he
Yep.
names the triplets of evil and
Yep.
names America as the greatest purveyor of violence in the
In the
world, and
world.
also
Yep.
one of his most unpopular speeches among
Yep.
his peers when I think it was
Yep.
everybody but Otis Moss II
Yeah.
that on his board told him not to do it. And he said, that was the name of the talk, time to break the silence. I can't be silent anymore on Vietnam and war and militarism. So, um, but that relationship with Dr. Harding is something that you kind of have to uncover. A lot of folks don't know the name of Dr. Harding, and even those that do don't necessarily know the Anabaptist
The
roots that
extents,
you
right?
bring
Some know
out.
one piece, but not the other piece. And there's really to understand him and how he got to where he was is to understand these two streams kind of shaping his own social and theological imagination. Absolutely.
So to rewind just a little bit, because I want to get back to Dr. King and the powerful line that you bring out, where have you been, the Anabaptist. But for like you do a great job with the summarizing 500 years of Anabaptist history and pulling out some gems in it. But like give a little bit of that, not just the history, but why it's important for us today and what it has to offer us at its best. We'll get to the bones to spit out and the blind spots, but
Yeah.
yeah, like kind of for folks that might be new to Anabaptists and
Yeah. And
think,
one of the things I think is a little bit different about how I even label Anabaptism, I kind of take issue with how many white North American Anabaptists have described their own tradition. And I want to argue that actually the most meaningful way to describe it is as an anti-Christendom tradition, right?
yeah,
No, so not first as a peace church tradition, not saying that that's not important, but I think actually naming it as an anti-Christendom tradition is really significant for its own reckoning with its own history, and that can help orient its ongoing faithful witness today. So the Anabaptists arise in the midst of Reformation, right? And there's a lot of social unrest happening at that time. So you have poor peasants' rebellions taking place, right, because of the economic exploitation and oppression people are experiencing. And there's this Reformation taking place, most notably by folks like Martin Luther, John Calvin, Zwingli, all those guys. And then here come the
and
Anabaptists
you do mean
who,
guys.
what's that? Yeah.
And you do mean guys, yeah.
Yeah. And so you have these Anabaptists who emerge, um, who are taking seriously some of the ideas of the Reformation, but want to go even further in terms of what it means to actually follow Jesus and take Jesus seriously as a way of life and to define what it means to be a Christian in light of that, right?
Yeah.
So where maybe the reformers, the Protestant reformers, or sometimes we say the magisterial reformers, are defining Christianity as by justification by faith or something like that, they're not necessarily disagreeing that that's not true, that we are justified by faith, but they want to center the definition of Christian as actually following Jesus, right?
Word. Yeah.
And that's pretty novel for the Protestant Reformation and is in conversation with the Catholic Church, but there's also some Protestant influences as well. So there, some people call Anabaptists Protestant and Catholic. Some say they're neither Protestant or Catholic, but either way, there's an interesting hybrid of conversations happening with those different things. But it's happening in conversation with the unrests of the peasants, of the peasant rebellions. Almost all of the Anabaptists that emerge in conversation with the unrests, the economic unrests, right? And so they're just offering a different way of actually engaging and responding to it. In fact, many of the Anabaptists actually participated in some of the violent revolutions that were taking place and then switched over into more nonviolent forms
Like some
of
of
practice.
Jesus's followers. Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
right. Yeah.
Yeah. And so I think that that's really important context that there's this economic, almost liberationist emphasis of the early Anabaptists, as well as this real strong anti-Christendom posture that wants to make a radical break from how church and state are embedded and entwined coercively from the top down, right? So they're
Yeah.
breaking from all of that.
Yeah, I thought you did a good job. I mean, one of my convictions has been similar to yours is that here Christians are, Catholics and Protestants, that they're killing each other, they're
Yep.
jailing each other, and sometimes they're killing each other over like whether or not the bread and wine is the real
Right.
body of Christ. You're
That's
like, dude, I
right.
think you missed the whole point, right?
Yeah, you're
And
missing the point.
but then you got the radical reformers in the middle of that. But you know, the Reformation was critical and justifiably critical of the power of the Vatican, and the papacy and the like corruption in the Catholic Church, selling indulgences, all this stuff. But then as it progresses, it still becomes this kind of divine sanctioning of the state, right?
Yeah.
And that's why Martin Luther, I mean, some things right, but he got a whole lot of things wrong when it came to state. I mean, even on the death penalty, we kind of call him the celebrity endorsement because he said not only is the executioner the hand of the state, but the executioner is the hand of God.
Yeah.
Like literally, the state becomes God's
Becomes
instrument,
authorized for that.
and,
Right.
and God's instrument to kill, right?
Yeah.
And some of the really terrible stuff that happens is kind of the poisonous fruit of some of that theology. And I'm not saying there wasn't anything good out of the Reformation, but I think that's where the radical reformers shine so brightly is they're centered
Differentiate.
around Jesus. They're centered
Yeah.
around the Sermon on the Mount. They refuse to kill. They have this, real sense that like the early martyrs of the church, that they're willing to die, but they're sure not willing to kill. And we
That's right.
disgrace Jesus when we do. So,
Yeah.
yeah, it's beautiful. And then you say like part of where it gets gnarly, well, it's not necessarily your word, but like is when you begin to tell the contemporary, the last few couple hundred years of that history. And
Yeah.
say a little bit more about that because a lot of
Yeah.
it, a lot of the romanticism, and not even just romanticism, the celebration of Anabaptism at its best is it kind of ends around,
Yeah.
the 1600s or whatever,
Yeah.
right? So yeah.
Yeah. So one of the things I kind of frame in, and this is my way of teasing my Anabaptist peers who I love dearly, but is I say we got to pay attention to how Anabaptists tell their own history, right? And so Anabaptists love talking about early church and Constantine and how the church got in bed with the state and how early church,
Oh, you get me
didn't.
excited. You get me excited, man.
Yeah, so I mean, it's speaking the language, right? It's almost like embedded in the tradition of Anabaptists to be able to think about early church and then after Constantine, and its power dynamics being analyzed, and then Reformation, right? Same thing. There's magisterial reformers who are also Christendom's top-down, coercive, and violent, and the radical reformers who are being persecuted, right? And power dynamics are being explored. But then when Anabaptists talk about North American experience of being Anabaptist, then all of a sudden it's like, they're talking about church splits and last names and shoe fly pie and all these things. And I'm like, all right, that's important. I'm not saying to not talk about that history, but where's the power analysis for one's own tradition in the last several centuries? What I argue is that part of the reason why we don't see some of that um, analysis, that careful analysis of our place within society for Anabaptists, is because they were assimilating into white dominant cultural identity and practice in many ways, not in all ways, but in many ways, especially in terms of what it meant to be a white settler in this land, right? And so as land is being stolen, dispossession of land from indigenous people, they're not the ones forcibly removing people off the lands, but they're getting it for cents on the acre, right? And benefiting from other people violently imposing that on indigenous people. Or when slavery's happening, they mostly agree that slavery was wrong, unlike most traditions did here in the US. And yet they're benefiting from without pushing against the slave economy that's enriching them, right? And so some of what I want them to see is that they're assimilated into uh, North America and benefited from being white, but then became politically quietist in response to these massive, serious evils. And so I actually, maybe controversially, revoke the peace church card, right? And
Mhm.
say that's an earned thing. That's not something you just, a peace church isn't just something, it's not a doctrine, right? It's embodied and lived out. And so maybe one day they can be a peace church in North America on Turtle Island by seeking shalom, by practicing shalom. And I do think the radical discipleship wing is seeking to do that. But I love to see the broader Anabaptist church take seriously how we live in the aftermath, not only of Christendom, but colonial conquest, right? The doctrine of discovery, all these things, and navigate in a more holistic way, seeking shalom where everyone belongs, where everyone matters, where everyone can thrive.
Yo, yeah. So like as you think of this, y'all, you got like you got the Amish, you got the Mennonites, you got the Quakers, you got the Brethren, you got all these different traditions that are weaving, and there's all kinds of other little factions
Yeah.
that split over things. But even the baptism, it's important to remember that this wasn't just a theological debate
Mm-mm.
over should we dedicate or baptize infants, but it was an extension of that state power, right? So say a
Yep.
little bit more about that. Like, because I think, sometimes you're like, yo, what's the big deal about
Right.
baptism?
Right.
Like, and it really was, it was like the bigger picture was about like what it really means to be a disciple and make a decision for Jesus and not have the
Yeah.
state kind of colonize you. So you
Yeah.
want to say a little bit more about that?
So again, this idea of Christendom, right? So you have church and state married together, and that develops over centuries. And so as early as around like Augustine's time, so we're talking like fourth, fifth century, sixth century, you begin to see this tradition grow of mandatory infant baptism by the state, right? So we're not just talking about local church practice, we're actually talking about the state. And what's happening at that moment is that you are being baptized into the church as well as simultaneously registered for the empire, right? Both simul. So this is a civic act. When you were baptized, it became a civic act, not just a doctrinal difference. Um, so I do think people get confused today because now we have a lot of doctrinal differences around how we think about baptism, right? Um, but for the most part, at least certainly in the US, it is just a doctrinal difference because no one is mandated to, it's not mandated for everyone to either engage in infant baptism or the other. So when the Anabaptists break from the states, they also refused to baptize their infants, which means they were refusing to register for the empire, right? It's a kind of uh, radical break completely and thoroughly in every way imaginable. That would be I would at first I was going to say civil disobedience, but it's uncivil disobedience in the eyes of the states, right?
Yeah.
That this is an act, this is treasonous acts, and so yeah, I think to understand the socio-political implications
Yeah.
of baptizing as adults and the even the term Anabaptism, it's a term that comes back that was used against the Donatists, the North African Christians in the early church who were being accused of rebaptizing and then therefore can be persecuted and tortured as heretics, right? That's what, so when in the 16th century they're called Anabaptists, this is not a self-professed term. This is something that Anabaptists adopted later. But at that time, it's basically saying you're a heretic and we can torture you and we can burn you at the stake at the stake on both behalf of the church and the state together, deeming you a heretic.
Yeah, so good. So we're going to make a pivot in just a minute. And by the way, if you're just joining in, sometimes folks are seeing it on our website or socials or whatever. This is the book we're talking about, Making It Plain. It's Dr. Drew Hart's book, and the subtitle is Why We Need Anabaptism in the Black Church. We are at the half hour, so we're going to make a pivot into the Black church part, and then we'll
Yeah.
talk about the overlap some. But to wrap up the Anabaptist part a little bit, because they intersect, and this is
Yeah.
like you're kind of
Yep.
flowing these together in kind of a dance, a theological dance, and but the a lot of times the idea is that that who we are, we're in the world but not of the world. Our kingdom is not of this world, but it's the kingdom of God. The witness of the church is the church. The church is our witness. Our communities are demonstration plots for the
Yeah.
kingdom of God. Like that's good Anabaptist theology. It's like kind of we're embodying the good news of our message, the way that we share, the way that we love each other, the way that we interact with our enemies, all that stuff. It's why they have quilts at protests and they sing so
Yeah.
well and like but there's also, I have a real dear love, like you do, for the best of Anabaptism, and have been a part of that tradition in and out over the years. Um, but it's often sometimes withdrawn from political engagement, and it's been kind of
Yeah.
a clunky thing to figure that out. So
Yeah.
when Dr. King said this line in 1959, I think you said, where he meets an Anabaptist and says, "Where have you been?" Because
Right.
it lines up so much with
Yeah.
the embodiment of who Dr. King's become, of the best of the Black church and liberation, while and even like personal and social salvation or
Yep.
transformation, and the peacemaking, the nonviolence that Dr. King's leaning into from Gandhi and others. So, like, where have you been is a good question. So, say a little bit more about that, man. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, he's just he it's a unveiling of some of the failures of the Anabaptist movement at that particular moment. And Anabaptists, they were restricted, especially from the early 20th century going into the mid 20th century. Their primary language for thinking about their peace ethic is actually non-resistance, right? That's the language that was actually being used. And so they felt like we can't resist evil, right? We just suffer passively in response to what's going on. So that is some of the challenges. And then the two kingdom theology that says there's this full line, like we don't engage in political things at all, right? And that's not all Anabaptists, but certainly a large swath of them certainly thought and engaged in that particular way. And so when King is challenging them externally, and Vincent Harding internally, it's really pushing them to embody more faithfully actually a faith that looked more like Jesus, right? Because Jesus was not just hunkered down in his own little faith community as an alternative. He's actually embodying that in the public square, clashing in society, on behalf of the least, last, lost, little ones, and left out, right? And so that's the imagination and so I certainly invite Anabaptists to think about folks like Pilgrim Marpeck and others. Even Menno Simons had a more nuanced way of understanding two kingdom theology than I think is often expressed today. And so much of the development that has happened in more contemporary since the civil rights movement is out of direct uh, observation of King and what he was doing. And he had Mennonite theologians writing constantly about King and trying to figure this out. Like, what does this mean for us? And so King externally and Harding internally really played a significant role in expanding the imagination of many Anabaptists. And so much of the protests that we see today, you see some of the Gaza protests, all these things, like that's a deep influence of the Black church, the prophetic stream of the Black church, shaping and stretching the imagination of the Anabaptist movement to more faithful witness.
Yeah, and now I think it's probably worthwhile to give the little brief sketch of why there is a historic Black church. And being in
Yeah,
Philly, we've got those roots, y'all. In
yeah,
fact, our two friends of ours, Chaz Howard, who's the chaplain at University of
yeah.
Pennsylvania, and Lisa Sharon Harper,
Mhm.
uh, we did a tour of the downtown area of the. There's a whole lot to take in, but we videoed it, and it is absolute gold. So we're editing it up, and it's going to be on the website, so you'll be able to like do a walkthrough some of the history, but just like a brief history of that of Absalom Jones
Yeah,
and the Mother Bethlehem, the birth of St. Thomas. Like give
yeah,
a little
yeah,
history of that because it's important that it came out of exclusion.
yeah,
The Black
absolutely.
church started as not the Black church, but a church that just welcomed everybody and received everybody as equally a child of God because they were being discriminated against in the other church.
Yeah, yeah. So Western Christianity. So if the way the book is kind of framed, it's kind of like a church history, like evolving story, right? And so I talk about the development of the doctrine of discovery, how the church, Christendom church, creates both doctrine and law that encourages the plunder and conquest and enslavements of other people all around the world, right? In Africa, in the Americas, and parts of Asia. And so you have that story. So you have this, what develops is a white supremacist Christianity in the United States. Christianity is deeply, deeply, deeply entangled in all of that in its mainstream forms, right? And so as Black people here in this land are encountering and navigating slavery and such, and being told that God endorses their enslavement, God endorses their oppression, that this is the social order God has arranged, they nonetheless steal away
Hmm.
into the hush harbors, into their own spaces, and they encounter a very different God and a very different Jesus, right?
Hmm.
And the Jesus that they encounter is it's a Jesus that is a Moses type who's going to lead them into freedom. It's a Jesus who's a co-sufferer through their hardships, right? It's a Jesus who understands their trials, but nonetheless is going to help them make it through the storm and through the night. And so this counter witness, this counter experience of uh of knowing who God is for themselves, reinterpreting and challenging the kind of assumptions of the church. That's the birth of the Black
Hmm.
church. First under slavery in what people call the invisible institution, and then eventually into more formal like Black denominations. And so when you talk about like, Absalom Jones and all that, like
Richard
in
Allen. Yep.
Philly, like what we're talking about, I mean, it's a powerful scene if you can imagine. There are Black, this is not a, they're all worshiping together, right? So sometimes people get the idea like there's either segregation or no, they're all in the same worshiping space together, but they created segregated seating, right? So black folk have their second tier members of the church and have to be in the balcony. And so Absalom Jones and Richard Allen, I think it's Absalom Jones, he's praying and he's told he needs to get up because he's in the white people's space. Right. And he's like, let me finish. Let me finish. No, 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 no. You need to get up. And so he ends up leaving a processional march right out of the church with all the black folk. Right. And what's happening there, because some people will ask, well, isn't that segregation? I'll say, no, there's a difference between segregation and withdrawal.
Yeah.
Right. Right. Segregation is the logics of what was happening in that church. Two tiers of humanity, even in the body of Christ, that's upholding white supremacy still, even as they all gathered under one roof. What they were withdrawn from is a rejection of white supremacist Christianity. And so all of Richard Allen's writings, it was clear that we come from one humanity, right? Everyone's welcome in Christ. And at the same time that they had this universal understanding of the gospel, still had the sensibilities to understand but there's a particular need to respond to the gospel for African people, right? So it's this African Methodist Episcopal has a very focused emphasis on Black people's lived experiences and still universal that everyone could have been welcomed into that space. And I always
Yeah.
tell people today, like, people think, oh, the multicultural church movement, which is usually white churches inviting people of color into their spaces. And I'm like, well, the Black church was always that opportunity, just that white people never opted in, right, to that opportunity to worship because they didn't want to be under Black leadership and worship as truly, fully equals around Christ.
Yeah. Ooh, well, that was, I mean, come on, you're gonna have to take the whole Drew Hart course, but that's a good start. And okay, so I'm because we're friends, I feel like I can get into it, man. But
Yeah,
I'm
yeah,
gonna
let's
say
go.
like I resonated with a lot of the critiques and have felt them personally with some of the Anabaptists. And also, I thought you were very fair to the beauty and the best of it. There were some really cool things that you brought out, the connection with the labor, even the interactions between the Quakers and the Mennonites and stuff,
Yeah,
just gold. With the historic Black church, man, I felt like, I mean, you say the Black church needs its own come to Jesus moment.
yeah,
I want to hear more about it because
yeah,
I've been shaped and inspired. A part of
yeah,
what sustains me right now are
yeah,
is that spiritual space, you know. I mean, because you actually use the word there are prophetic exceptions, but I mean, I think of, Otis Moss and
yeah,
Nichelle Goodry and Leslie Callahan here in
yeah. That's the
Philly,
prophetic stream.
Reverend Barber,
Yeah,
Tracy Blackman. I was just with her, Bill Lamar, like all these folks. Um, Michael McBride and the Black
yeah.
Church
Those
Pack,
are all
CC Jones
friends. Yep.
Davis, all those folks. So those feel like a lot of exceptions. So I'm just I want to hear more about it. I'm
Yeah. All right.
uh
So here's the
yeah,
thing,
go ahead.
Shane, right? Here's the thing is, um, I'm almost friends with almost every single person you mentioned or know them well enough, right?
Yeah.
And love their ministries and what they do. But nine times out of 10, if you were to just stumble into the next closest Black church, you're not necessarily stumbling into what I would call the prophetic stream of the Black church, right? And so you got some that are leaning towards prosperity gospel. You've got some that have more of a, I would say, have internalized too much of the white evangelical gospel, American gospel, right? You have all these things going on, and it's only one stream of the Black church that is actually, I would say, embodying that prophetic witness in the society. And that's true even going back, like during the civil rights movement, there were so many Black churches that were not involved in the civil rights movement. Everybody, it's interesting right now, like we all, and that includes my own church, right? Like the church tradition I came up in was not a part of that prophetic, really out there bearing witness to the gospel through working for justice, right? And so yeah, we were anti-racist, but not discipling people to actually fight and struggle as a mode of faith itself.
Mm.
Um, and so yeah, I love the Black
So
church.
yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
I love the Black church. I'm a byproduct of the Black church, but there is a lot of nostalgia that I
Yeah,
think
yeah.
exists. And we all like to take credit for what a portion of the Black church actually engaged in. And I just want us in the Black church to also be honest and do some own reckoning. Like, I'm working here in Harrisburg. I remember I visited a whole bunch of black churches, and it was so disappointing how unconcerned so many of them were as like Black Lives Matter stuff is going on, right? Like their preaching was so disconnected. I think if you talk to them individually, even the pastors would say, oh yeah, these things matter, but they didn't understand and couldn't articulate how the gospel of Jesus Christ speaks to these social issues. So I do think that there's a need to be honest. And that's what Eddie Glad, I referenced his
Yeah,
piece, right?
yeah,
The Black Church is dead. That was his concern. That was like a decade ago, right? Wanting the Black church to rediscover the heart of why it exists in the very first place, and not just assimilate slowly and more into just mainstream white American evangelical kind of orientations, or even worse, sometimes prosperity gospel. So yeah, there are
yeah,
lots of prophetic streams, right?
yeah,
Folks in the prophetic stream, there's lots of that. And yet I can't say that's not the majority of the Black church. And it doesn't mean that there's not good things happening. I think that even in a church like I grew up in, that I would say is not a part of the prophetic stream, there were prophetic moments within our congregations that certainly differentiated us from maybe white evangelicals.
yeah,
But I don't
yeah,
think that's a good example. I don't think that's the bar that we want to set. I think Jesus is the bar that we want to kind of hold ourselves to. Yeah.
yeah. Well, and I think you make a good point about like not living in the past and not riding the wave of the 60s and nostalgia, all that. I see at least I see a lot of really beautiful signs like
Yeah.
when Michael and others pulled together the 1,000 black church leaders
Yeah.
speaking out on Gaza and things
Yeah.
like that. I mean, that's not a small group of people. And, it was a
Right.
full page New York Times article. And, I think of, Dr. West and others and so many folks I kind of feel like the Creflo Dollars are the exception. And, but
Yeah,
I
of
hear
that
you.
extreme, the
Yeah,
prosperity
yeah,
gospel. But I wonder, Shane, to what degree you're in the space, that space between the prophetic and the prosperity gospel. That is a large stream of
yeah,
folks who fit within that space, who I think, I mean, I'm talking to folks all the time who even have shared to me like they're frustrated sometimes with their own pastors not speaking up on things that are happening within the community, right? And so there is this other group that exists beyond the extremes of the prosperity gospel and beyond what I would say is the faithful witness of the prophetic stream. There's a lot of folks who are not connecting the gospel to the social concerns that are impacting Black people. And I think that's why even in the Black churches that seem to be most healthy right now are within the prophetic stream, or maybe some of them are prosperity gospel because they're just consumerist, right? But the churches that are struggling most, I think it's because the gospel is not relating to the actual felt needs and concerns that are most pressing, especially for this emerging generation.
yeah, cool. Yeah, and we got some questions coming in. Our boy Jared McKenna's on there,
Yeah, yeah,
like
yeah, yeah.
trying to stump the teacher question on there, and then we got one from Jason and others. So keep them coming. We'll get to those in just a second. There's a couple of things left, man. I wanted to bat around from the book. One of them is as you're looking at the history and the prophetic beauty of the historic black church.
Yeah.
You One of the things you say is the vote is not how black people became free,
Yeah.
and I think maybe that there's a lot in that to
Yeah.
unpack, like what it looks like to have a politically engaged but nonpartisan, leaning towards the suffering and the poor without looking to Caesar to solve it. There's a lot in that. So just say a little bit more about that because I think it's
Yeah.
an invitation to engage in the best of both of these traditions, and
Yeah.
not just pull out and but also not just to become partisan, throw all our chips in with the DNC or something.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So one of the things that I've heard a lot in among some of my Black peers and in the Black church, even growing up, is, how important the vote is. The vote is sacred and we've got to utilize it. And in many ways, I'm like, yes, right? Like it's important to participate in the electoral process and to engage in that way. But what sometimes seems to happen is that we've elevated the vote as the singular mechanism for social change in some spaces that I think are not as engaged in, let's say, organizing or protests or movement, more grassroots social change efforts, right?
Yeah.
And so my challenge is for those that are so stuck on only thinking about the options handed to us from the government, right? As the vehicle for social change, is that that's not even how we got free,
Yeah.
right? That for hundreds of years, like we didn't even have any political say, and people were not sitting around twiddling their fingers waiting for the vote. They fought, they actually earned the votes by struggling at the grassroots level, organizing, creating institutions, abolitionist speeches, this, that, underground, right? All kinds of things were happening. So they were socio-politically active in a whole myriad of ways, both against slavery, in the struggle for civil rights. And I think that we've got to remember this wide available way of actually being politically active outside of just voting.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
it's
Yeah.
right. It's not that I do vote, and I think I encourage people to vote as well. And I respect people who don't, right? Because I actually know some people who are very active. That was something I was not aware of until it was actually some folks in the radical discipleship stream who I know who do not vote, but who are not, I would by no means are not politically lazy at all, right?
Yeah.
They're engaged in organizing work, they're engaged at that local level. And I can respect that, even though I think it's helpful for us to vote
Yeah.
anyway. I can respect their witness because they understand the wide range of ways that we can actually impact our society. So I think that's some of what I'm
Right.
getting
Yeah.
at is to remember our legacy and engage in those full political options of the church for social change at the grassroots level, including voting.
Yeah, I did a couple of conversations with Stanley Hauerwas, who's probably one of the more influential Anabaptist theologians
Yeah,
out and
yeah,
still alive today. He's awesome. We had a great conversation. It was challenging. I pushed him just a gentle little bit on a
yeah,
few
yeah,
things,
yeah,
but I mean, he says something like, he's kind of cynical and got that grumpy old man kind of thing. He's always had that, but yeah, he's kind of got this. Uh, I vote, but it's the most unexcited thing I do every 4 years kind of vibe. But I feel like there's an intersection with how Dr. King viewed voting too, and when he says like a law can't make a man love me, but it can make it harder for a man to kill me.
that's right.
And so it feels like, yeah, voting doesn't change everything. There's holy work to change racist hearts, but the role of the
It's an
government
important
is to try to
piece.
protect life a little bit, right? And so
Absolutely.
that's why I've
It's
come to say, like,
yeah,
I think voting is harm reduction, damage
yeah,
control. I'm voting for the
absolutely.
person, not the savior, but I'm voting for
Right.
the person I think is going to do the least amount of damage in the
Yeah.
world. It's a little bit of the maybe that's a little of the
And I think we've got to
pessimism you talk
use
about.
everything available to us when we have opportunity to either protect and keep the amount of flourishing that at least exists,
Yeah.
or to take us another step in the right direction, moving closer and closer towards that kind of flourishing. And so, yeah, we use all the means possible to kind of extend and seek shalom in our society.
Cool. So we just got a few minutes left. We should at least acknowledge that our dear brother, your podcasting
Yeah, my
partner,
homie
is
Jared is here.
trying to bring up the the authoritarian Christian nationalism and the rise of it. What could Anabaptism be today if it was to learn from the prophetic Black church and kind of confronting Christian nationalism?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the prophetic witness, right, to see Anabaptists really lean in broadly to the prophetic witness of the church, right? To speak truth to power, to confront in a way that I think is a part of their own history. That is, the early Anabaptists spoke truthfully about what was going on in their society and clashed with the powers and took risks, not just to proclaim good news in terms of converting people, but also to the powers and the harm that was happening all around them, towards the economic realities that were happening all around them as well. And so I think that Anabaptists should, number one, already because of their anti-Christendom orientation, be allergic to Christian nationalism to begin with. But then if they actually learn from the Black church in terms of how to actually seek change, to pursue justice for everyone, not be politically quietist, right? And I know that's sometimes unfair for some contemporary Anabaptists who I think have already learned these lessons, but I think more still are still wrestling with how to engage faithfully in the political realm, while not, selling their souls to Caesar, right? And I think that it's good to be wrestling with that so that they don't get co-opted, but it's also important to not allow that to not be faithful. And I think that Jesus provides a model that then is picked up by the Black church of prophetic witness, of clashing, of embodying, Isaiah 58 and Isaiah 61, right?
Mm.
The Spirit of the Lord is upon me because He's anointed me to bring good news to the poor, release to the captives, recovery of sight to the blind, to let the oppressed go free, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor. It's that spirit that needs to be taken up, not only on its own behalf, because that's usually when Anabaptists in North America have spoken up, is to avoid conscription for themselves. But what would it look like to seek liberation for other people who are oppressed, for those who are most vulnerable, domestically and abroad, right? I'm seeing that more and more, even over the last 10, 20 years. I've seen that more and more. But I would love to see the mainstream Anabaptist tradition really embrace that, not just the radical edges of it.
Yo. Yeah, and one of the things that you said at like in the book was when you talk about this interaction with, I mean, kind of leads towards the rise in white supremacy in the overt sense that we see it right now. I keep thinking of when Donald Trump said he doesn't have a racist bone in his body, and I think it was AOC that said, "I'm not worried about your bones. I'm worried about your heart and your policies
And your
and your
policies.
rhetoric and everything else is
Yeah.
hurting people."
Yeah.
But you said that there's a lot of folks that think that black folks and white folks are equal, but they still believe that black culture is inferior. So, man,
Yeah.
that was a zinger. I feel like it kind of puts a finger on something that maybe you want to say a little bit more about. And yeah, that was deep at the end of the book. You were saying that. Yeah.
Yeah, I don't even remember exactly what I said at that moment, but I do think that that is, you know, it's one thing to assign bodies as inferior and superior, right? But what we don't realize is still white supremacy when you deem a whole entire culture as superior or inferior to others. And so I think that there's a lot of work that needs to be done in terms of how white supremacy has shaped people's social and cultural imaginations, to judge and belittle and find no worth and value, nothing to learn from others. And I think that as the Black church and Anabaptists merge together into this kind of Anablactivist faith, some of it's not only to have this anti-Christendom tradition, but it's to decolonize our faith itself, right?
Yeah.
That there's a lot of decolonizing work. Not just a lot of times, it's like historically, it's been those on the underside of colonial oppression and imperialism that have focused on decolonizing. And now it's time for our white brothers and sisters to also realize that their own faith is so diseased and mangled that they also have to do decolonizing work as well, so that they can actually come and actually see the beauty of the global church as well as the church here in the US, and the different gifts that exist when we sit around the table as equals.
Dude, it's why it's also so refreshing to every time I'm with Christian Palestinians, like theologians, pastors, you just have this ancient but very fresh uh, engagement centered around Jesus, critical of empire, already decolonized. It's like a corrective and a cure to so much that is wrong in a lot of the evangelicalism. So
Yeah,
yeah, and I think the decolonizing is helpful language because it's not just that we need to tear stuff down, we need to take it back.
that's
Like
right.
we need to not allow the Franklin Grahams to have the only narrative and monopoly
That's right.
on Christianity. So, um, dude, we're almost out of time. Anything we didn't talk about though? That I mean, there's just so much.
There's so
The
much,
book's
right? I mean,
awesome, y'all. This is
we
it.
can't get into everything.
Yeah. Any closing words though? I'm gonna send this out with your words as a benediction, but you want to like any lingering thought? I never want to cut anybody off,
Just
dude.
at the end of the day, I think that the Black church and Anabaptist traditions invite us to take Jesus seriously, his way of life, who he associated with, the realities all found, I think, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, right? Like, I think that as we immerse ourselves in the Jesus story and seek to follow Jesus into the world, these two traditions become really gifts for grappling with white Christian nationalism, with the neo-fascism and authoritarianism and reactionism that we see going on right now, that is literally having death-dealing impacts on
Yes,
our neighbors. Like we're prepping as our church to think about members who are going to lose their SNAP benefits, right? It's
my
like
Lord,
we're
we are
trying to
too.
figure out like how are we going to fill in the gap because of the death dealing policies that are going to impact our neighbors and our friends and our loved ones. And so I think that these two traditions actually are really, really timely, especially in conversation together for grappling with some of these big questions. I often say they're not the only traditions that have gifts, right? But I do think that there are some special insights that these and wisdom that these traditions offer for us in these kind of moments that ought to be taken seriously.
Yeah, bro. Oh man, I to bring it home, like when you were saying that, I was just thinking like just an hour ago, um, my neighbor said that one of our other neighbors has been to my house 3 times today, like banging on the door. And I said, "Was there an emergency?" And and they said, "No, he's just worried about his SNAP benefits getting taken and like not sure how he's going to make it."
Yeah.
And like I think the stat is like 30% of Philadelphians
Yeah.
rely not totally on SNAP, but it's a part of how they make it.
Yep.
So this is real, y'all. It's real, and I think this idea that both the best of Anabaptism and the anti-Christendom tradition and the Black Church have so much to offer us right now: life-giving faith, better theology, and an invitation to an activist life and to get involved, to get in the streets. And so, thanks, bro, for the gift of this book. Y'all keep checking it out. I'm gonna close with a paragraph, just a paragraph of this, and join us if y'all can on November 1st for morning prayer, and keep hanging out with us at Red Letter Christians. And Drew, thanks, buddy. Thanks for tonight. Thanks for this book. So this is page 54, just a little paragraph that struck me as so powerful. So, this holistic path of Anabaptism nurtured within me an anti Christendom, decolonial, anti racist inclination that seems desperately needed for the present crisis in mainstream America. With the entrenchment of white Christian nationalism and many Christians co signing neo fascism in our society today, now is an important moment to share how Black theology and Anabaptism together can be a gift for those seeking to live out a faithful witness of Jesus and his way. We need a more radical way, a prophetic witness to and worship of God that offers credible good news instead of the domesticated, violent, oppressive, whitened, status quo, power hungry, and savior of empires type of Christianity proclaimed by imperial puppets in the in the public square. Boom. That's your benediction, y'all. Thanks, my brother. Thanks, y'all, for tuning
Appreciate
in.
you.
Yeah. Bless you. Thanks, Brandon.